Hello everyone. Uh, in this lecture, we'll be discussing about metaphysical poets. Before we move on with our lecture, I would request all of you to please subscribe to my channel if you have not subscribed to it so far, so that you may receive the content as soon as I upload it. Now, in this lecture, we'll divide this lecture into uh, certain parts. We'll first see the historical context in which metaphysical poetry was being written. Uh, in the second part, we'll see uh, why metaphysical poetry is called so, and is it a misnomer. In the third section, we'll see the features of metaphysical poetry, and finally, we'll discuss some of the major metaphysical poets at the end of our lecture. Starting with our lecture, mm, first we have to understand that metaphysical poetry was being written in the 17th century. That is, uh, in some parts in the period of James I, Charles I, and also uh, during the period of the Commonwealth. So it is a movement which extends for a good, half a century, and there are certain great poets who wrote unique poetry during this period. You know that in the Elizabethan period, Edmund Spenser was one of the major poets who was writing, and his poetry was more about romance. His poetry was more about imagination. His poetry was, uh, we may say, aesthetically pleasing, but it was so rich, so luxuriant, that uh, it did not quite suit the taste of the classicists, of the intellectuals, and therefore, in the 17th century, we see a reaction to the kind of poetry that Edmund Spenser wrote. The reaction came from two schools. The first one was the classical school led by Ben Jonson, and the second one was the philosophical school, the intellectual school, which was led by John Donne. Now, the followers of Ben Jonson were classicists, and they were writing cavalier poetry, and they called themselves sons of Ben also. Poets like Robert Herrick, poets like John Suckling, Carew, Lovelace, these are the cavalier poets. Around the same time, uh, some poets who were writing different style of poetry became very popular. Those poets included John Donne, George Herbert, uh, Richard Crashaw, then Andrew Marvell, Richard Cowley, Abraham Cowley, and these poets were called as the metaphysical poets. Now we uh, will see how the term metaphysical came into existence. Uh, Actually, the term metaphysics was first used by John Dryden in 1693 in an essay on John Donne, in which John Dryden said that John Donne affects the metaphysics even in his amorous poetry. So, it was a term which was used by John Dryden derisively. That means he made fun of the kind of poetry that John Donne wrote. Uh, but the currency of the term metaphysical poets was gained only when Dr. Samuel Johnson, in his Lives of Poets, discussed uh, uh, the life of Abraham Cowley, and there he used the term metaphysical poets. So, all the poets, John Donne and the poets who wrote poetry like him, came to be called as metaphysical poets. Now, there is a misconception that is prevalent that metaphysical poetry is about the other world. It is not about this world. It is about something beyond the mundane existence of our own. So, but this is not exactly the fact. They were very much rooted in our own mundane existence. So it is not that they wrote poetry which was out of this world. They, in fact, were quite realistic in their poetry. So much so that much of their poetry is about love, it is about uh, aspects of philosophy, it is about an intellectual honesty. Uh, the term metaphysical is actually a misnomer, or it can be said that it is uh, a pejorative term which was used first of all by Dr. Samuel Johnson. Dr. Samuel Johnson had very unflattering things to say regarding the metaphysical poets. He said that they were men of learning and their sole endeavor was to show their learning. So, the other thing that he said is that the metaphysical poets used highly conceited language which showed their arrogance and intellectual arrogance. He also leveled the charge of obscurity against the metaphysical poets. And that is why, because of all these features, it, according to Dr. Samuel Johnson, these features made the poetry of these poets, John Donne and his followers, uh, look like something out of the ordinary, something out of this world, something which may be called as outlandish. And that is why he used this term. Uh, but with time, this term has gained acceptance and is now no longer considered pejorative. Uh, this is about the history of the metaphysical poetry, the historical context, and how latter criticism looked at it, especially the 18th century criticism. Now, what are the features of metaphysical poetry? Metaphysical poetry, as I've already told you, it was uh, highly intellectual in nature. It was not romantic, it was not only about aesthetics, it was about thoughts. It was about how uh, it was a poem that appealed to the mind. Also, it appealed to the senses. Uh, that is why T.S. Eliot, the great critic, in his essay The metaphysical poets say that there is fusion of emotion and reason, there is fusion of thought and feeling in the poetry of metaphysical poets, which Eliot calls association of sensibility. The second feature of metaphysical poetry is the abundance of metaphysical conceits. Now, what is a metaphysical conceit? A metaphysical conceit is nothing but a comparison, but it is not a simple comparison. It is a, an extravagant, far fetched, and apparently unrelated comparison, which is somehow intellectually very innovative. So, this metaphysical conceit was a main feature of metaphysical poetry. For example, lovers being compared to the legs of a compass, or the image that a poet can eclipse the sun with a wink of an eye. These things are highly extravagant, they are far fetched. Uh, Dr. Samuel Johnson, in his essay on Abraham Cowley in his Lives of Poets, uh, said that the metaphysical conceit was just like yoking together of uh, dissimilar thoughts by violence. So, this is about metaphysical conceit, which is a part of, which is a feature of metaphysical poetry. Then we come to the themes of metaphysical poetry. Most of the poems that were written by the metaphysical poets were on religion. There were religious poetry. There was religious poetry. There was also love poetry. A lot of love poetry, which was very erotic. Uh, there is platonic as well as neoplatonic love involved in uh, the poetry that metaphysical poets wrote. Uh, as far as language is concerned, they were not afraid to use colloquial language. The formal elements were there, but they did not, the metaphysical poets did not shy away from being colloquial in their tone. Uh, Another feature of metaphysical poetry is that it believed in an abrupt opening which surprised the readers, and then the argument was carried forward. Uh, and there is a lot of concern with God, a lot of concern with religion, and there is a lot of concern with the realistic world as well, the mundane world. So these are some of the important features of metaphysical poetry. Now we'll just look at some of the major poets. John Donne is a major poet. Uh, he is regarded as probably one of the greatest poets of the 17th century. His collection of poems are the Songs and Sonnets and the Holy Sonnets. Of course, he wrote other poems also. He was chiefly a Catholic who later turned into an Anglican priest, and his poetry is about love, his poetry is about religion. He was married to a lady called Anne More, and in his poems like Death Be Not Proud, or The Sun Rising, or Valediction Forbidding Mourning, or The Flea, he is at his peak. In these poems, he creates such poetry which is probably not seen in any other poet of the time. Uh, then we have George Herbert. He is also a very important poet. George Herbert is a religious poet. His collection of poems was titled The Temple, and in his poetry, in George Herbert's poetry, we get to see the pattern poems. For example, George Herbert wrote a poem called Easter Wings, and that is an example of a pattern poem where he creates a pattern with words. Uh, Much of George Herbert's poetry is musical and colloquial in tone. It is also uh, his poem expresses the dilemma sometimes between complete surrender to God and the will to live this life in this world. So, this is regarding George Herbert. Then we have other poets, poets like Richard Crashaw. Richard Crashaw wrote a collection of poems which is called The Steps to the Temple, which has obvious reference to George Herbert's poetry. Crashaw was more complex in his approach, and sometimes we find him writing really difficult poetry, highly conceited poetry. In his poems, there is a lot of influence of continental Europe. For example, the influence of Spain and the influence of Italy. Then we have another poet, that is Vaughan. Vaughan was a follower of George Herbert, and he also wrote religious poetry. There is one more poet called Thomas Traherne. His poetry was discovered rather late in the 19th century, and he is of historical interest because he follows the same style of poetry that John Donne wrote. We have Abraham Cowley, the poet who was responsible for the coinage of the term metaphysical poets by uh, Dr. Samuel Johnson. Cowley's life was discussed in detail by Dr. Samuel Johnson, and he had all the bitter things to say regarding Cowley. But be that as it may, Cowley was also mm, a thoughtful poet, and he wrote uh, intellectual poetry. Although he's not much read today, but obviously his contribution is also of a great historical importance. And finally, we have Andrew Marvell. Andrew Marvell is known mainly for his very famous poem, much anthologized, that is To His Coy Mistress. This was Andrew Marvell's probably the single most striking contribution to English literature. That poem remains a supreme example of combination of uh, uh, thought, the intellectual depth, and romantic love that is felt very strongly. So, in Andrew Marvell, we see the features that were made popular by John Donne culminated into some of very sensitive poetry that was written by Andrew Marvell. So, this is about our discussion on metaphysical poets. I hope you find this lecture worthy, and I once again request you all to please subscribe to my channel, like it, comment it, whatever you find it relevant, do it, and I'll see you in the next lecture. Thank you.